Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Just as the stories of conquest and imperialism are almost always told through the eyes of men, the stories of rebellion and uprising are also often seen through male eyes. Now, a new book by Hilary Klein relates a history of one of the most inspiring recent social and political movements through the eyes of its women. Companeras, Zapatista Women's Stories is a book about the women of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN. The Zapatistas were first launched onto the international stage in Chiapas, Mexico on January 1st, 1994. They became synonymous with the anti-globalization movement against neoliberal capitalism, and their enigmatic leader, Subcomandante Marcos, who never appeared without a ski mask covering his face, became a world-renowned resistance figure championing the rights of Mexico's indigenous people. But there were and are many women, like Major Ana Maria and Comandanta Ramona, who were just as fierce in their political commitment, but perhaps lesser known than Marcos. Joining me in studio today is Hilary Klein, author of the book Companeras, Zapatista Women's Stories. She lived in Chiapas, Mexico for several years, where she worked with women's projects in Zapatista communities. After she edited a book of Zapatista women's testimonies to be circulated in their own villages, women in the leadership there suggested that she compile a similar book for an outside audience. And she brings that book to us today. Welcome to Uprising, Hilary.
Thank you so much.
Now, you quote in your book one of the very important leaders, women leaders of the Zapatistas, Comandanta Esther, who gave a speech in 2001 in Mexico City's Central Plaza. She said, "We are oppressed 3 times over because we are poor, because we are indigenous, and because we are women." What conditions have Mexico's indigenous women faced, particularly at that time, that spurred them to join the EZLN?
So I think that's a great way to, sort of open this conversation. Zapatista women very much have recognized that intersection between the history of racism against indigenous people in Mexico, the poverty that they live in, and the sexism that they have faced as women. And many of those things go back really to the legacies of colonialism, the political structures, the economic structures, even the interpersonal structures that the villages, the rural villages of Chiapas were living in, really go back, sort of 500 plus years. And so the indigenous communities that make up the Zapatista movement really kind of refer to that history. But women in particular, before the Zapatista uprising, were living in conditions where women had very few rights. They were expected to stay in the home and take care of children. They were married very young, oftentimes against their will. They went on to have 10, 12, maybe 15 children, couldn't leave their homes without asking permission from their husband or their father, and domestic violence was fairly common. And then the sort of public realm of community affairs, of public decision-making, was very dominated by men. So in addition to, like I mentioned, the racism against indigenous communities, the poverty that these communities were living in, women in particular also faced that sort of triple oppression that Comandante Esther mentioned.